It's Black History Month of 2025. Last year, JVP in Albany decided that we would do a special Black History Month event.
While this is likely to be viewed during February of Black History Month in 2025, we're actually sitting here on January 19th, 2025, which is the day that the long-sought ceasefire is actually in place in Gaza. So this is really a momentous day. Literally millions of people around the world have been fighting for a ceasefire since October 7th. In Jewish Force for Peace, as well as the Palestine Solidarity Movement throughout the world, I think everybody's a little bit on edge today. Is this going to hold? Are people truly going to be safe? Are Palestinians who've been detained by Israel illegally finally going to be released? And will there be some opportunity for humanitarian aid to get in? The first few hours today have been promising along those regards, but this is, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know whether this will hold. Barbara, could you talk a little bit, share with us why it was important to share publicly the history of Black Palestinian solidarity as part of a celebration of Black History Month?
Well, there has been a history of African Americans and also Africans being in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for decades. I'm not sure exactly how far it goes back, but it definitely goes back to the mid-20th century with people like Muhammad Ali and also probably Malcolm X. But even before that, I think you know some of that earlier history of solidarity. I think that, and there's certainly contemporary examples of that too. I have been active in a group called Black for Palestine, which I think in 2014, I may have the dates wrong, I wasn't involved then, put out a statement around what was going on in Gaza and with Israeli policy toward the Palestinians at that time. And that group revived then in the fall of 2023. And we put out a statement signed by many people. So there's a contemporary aspect of it. And then there's also what was going on with the International Court of Justice and what was happening with South Africa having brought a case to the International Court of Justice. So there were a lot of kind of aspects and layers of that solidarity.
As we look back on the past almost a year and a half, a year of tremendous anguish, of despair, but also of enormous, beautiful solidarity around the world and here in Albany and in the capital region. So I think it's fitting that we revisit what we did a year ago and revisit the history of solidarity with Palestine in this country, as well as the history in this country of using the concept of genocide as a way to tackle and bring attention to, for example, the oppression and violence, the violent oppression against African Americans in this country.
There's Black and Jewish solidarity as well. So solidarity that's global, solidarity across borders, really the kinds of politics I think that we've been committed to all of our lives, and
Yes.
and particularly in need of during this tragic period in this tragic situation. The struggle is far from over. The struggle will continue, and of course, as members of JVP, I'm a member of JVP, just so you know. As members of JVP, we're committed to that end.
So that's what we tried to do last year, and we hope that that's what comes through in the video of last year's event.
Today we have with us Barbara Smith, who is an author, activist, and independent scholar who's played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national, cultural, and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She has been politically active in movements for social justice since the 1960s. She was co-founder of the Combahee River Collective and of Kitchen Table on the Fellow Press. She served 2 terms on the Albany Common Council from 2006 to 2013, and in 2005 she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. We also have with us Mark Mishler, a beloved and respected civil rights, criminal defense, and abolitionist lawyer in Albany. His decades of activist organizing includes work in the struggle to end racist policing in Albany, movements in solidarity with the people of Vietnam, Chile, Palestine, and South Africa, labor solidarity, and advocacy for public education. In 2014, he helped form the Albany chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. Mark also works on housing, prison, and criminal legal system policy in the New York State Legislature. Mark was inspired by his radical socialist parents to live a life in the fight for peace, justice, and liberation. Mark. Professor Nina Farnia is a legal historian and scholar of critical race theory, focusing on the role of modern imperialism in U.S. law and politics, particularly as it relates to freedom of speech and dissent. Her doctoral dissertation, Imperialism in the Making of U.S. Law, 1940 to 2008, is the 2023 co-winner of the Julian Mezzi Dissertation Award from the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and Humanities, and is the basis for her forthcoming book, Imperialism: An American Story. Prior to attending law school, she was a community organizer on the south side of Chicago and built campaigns against the school-to-prison pipeline and the racial profiling of youth of color. After law school, she participated on the legal teams for 2 Supreme Court cases, Dukes versus Walmart, the largest civil rights class action in U.S. history, and Fazaga versus the FBI, which challenged the use of government informants in mosques in Southern California. Welcome, Nina. And last but definitely not least, Khury Petersen-Smith is a researcher and activist strategist who focuses on the violence that the U.S. carries out and supports around the world, and working with others to end it. He is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Khury studied at Clark University School of Geography in Massachusetts, me too, and his dissertation focused on U.S. military bases and resistance movements against them in the Pacific. He is the co-author of the Black Solidarity with Palestine statement in 2015 and Black Voices for Ceasefire in Gaza statement in 2023. He traveled to Gaza in 2009. Khury lives in Boston but was born and raised in Albany. Welcome. So our esteemed panelists will build on the context of the recent South African petition to the International Court of Justice and the preliminary ruling of the court, which acknowledged the legitimacy of the allegation that Israel is engaged in genocidal actions in Gaza. It will draw connections between the Palestine liberation struggle, South African anti-apartheid movement, and Black liberation movements here. The panel will highlight the importance of intersectional and international solidarity. So to begin, each panelist will have some opening remarks, slides, and then we'll move into a Q&A portion. Did the note cards get handed out? Awesome. So if you have questions, please write them on your note cards during the opening remarks. They'll be collected at the end of the opening remarks and vetted and then read off by our second moderator. Thank you. So if you want a hand, are you going to go to the podium?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. We have worked really hard to bring you here today, and it's just wonderful. I hope somebody's taking a picture. I think we arranged for that, to take a picture of the audience for future use on social media. So, so sorry to be hoarse. What I'm going to talk about is what was happening in the United States in 1951 that would make it plausible to bring a petition to the United Nations charging genocide on behalf of the Negro people. That's who we were then. FYI, my twin sister and I were 5 years old in 1951. If you did not live through Jim Crow as one of its targets, or if you are not an historian of the period, it is difficult to understand just how pervasive and deeply embedded systemic racial oppression was. White supremacy enforced by violence, that is, racial terrorism, affected every aspect of Black people's lives. Unlike extrajudicial murders perpetrated by police officers today, during chattel slavery, Reconstruction, redemption, known by and to Black historians as the Nadir, because conditions were so horrific following the destruction of Reconstruction. And finally, during Jim Crow, the era in which I was born, every single encounter and interaction with a white person had the potential of ending up with violence or death. Now, this was more true of the South than it was of the North and the urban North. But when you look at the map, you will see, this is a map of lynchings in the United States. You can see that they happened everywhere, including in Ohio, where I grew up. Indiana, we knew Indiana was one of the worst states in the nation as far as it being racist and dangerous. These murders, here's another map. These murders, I should have double-spaced this, what was I thinking? These murders were virtually never prosecuted, let alone finding the assailant guilty. The lynching murder of Emmett Till in 1954 is a perfect example. The murderers acknowledged they had murdered Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago in Mississippi for the summer, and they admitted this in Look magazine, which was a major national magazine of the time, much like Life magazine. And even though they admitted that they had murdered him, they had been found not guilty before, I think, that article was published. And of course, they were never prosecuted. Every single aspect of U.S. life was segregated, and every single U.S. institution was designed to disadvantage Black people and dehumanize them, and also, in reality, to harm us. So I'm just basically going to take you through the slides that I have, and my minutes, I know, are almost gone as it is. No, I don't have carte blanche. I really don't, but that's really nice of you to say. She just said I had carte blanche, but I do not have carte blanche. Okay, whatever, people. Let's settle down, folks. Settle down. Anyway, the map that you saw that had the red on it is from the Institute for, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative, which opened in 2018. It has a museum in Montgomery. For those of you who can bear to have the experience, I know I'll never go because I can't deal with what I will see there. But I recommend that if you do go south and think about that, you could go. It's a remarkable, remarkable space. And the Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 racial terror lynchings, which is much more than even was thought a few years ago. When they opened, they were saying a little over 4,000. And now, on their website, it's 6,500. There are thousands more Black people whose deaths may never be discovered that have been killed by white lynch mobs. This is a headline from the Duluth Herald, and it is dated June 16th, 1920, I believe. It's hard to see if it's 20 or 1900, but anyway, 3 Negroes lynched in Duluth. How far below the Mason-Dixon line is Duluth, Minnesota? This is another headline. 3,000 will burn Negro. If you look to the right, it says, Negro jerky and sullen as burning our nears. If it wasn't real, it would read like science fiction. This is a very famous lynching photo. One of the things I had to do for this presentation was to look at dozens and dozens of lynching photos. I avoid that subject matter. My field, my profession is teaching African American literature. I've been doing that since the early 1970s. I'm quite familiar with this subject matter, but as I said, I try to avoid. I've never read a book about lynching. I don't think I've been to an exhibit about lynching, but for this presentation, I had to look at picture after picture after picture and choose. There are two bodies. I would suggest to you, if you're not familiar with the history of lynching, that you do the same thing that I did. Google racial lynchings, whatever, it'll all come up, images, and you can scroll through and see what this country is all about. The Equal Justice Institute has categorized lynchings, types of lynchings. There are lynchings based on fear of interracial sex, lynchings based on minor social transgressions, lynchings based on allegations of crime. Minor social transgressions are not moving out off the sidewalk when a white person is approaching you. You could easily get lynched for that. Public spectacle lynchings, lynchings targeting the entire African American community, lynchings of black people resisting mistreatment. This is a picture. I thought I would focus on health. That was brought up in the 1951 petition, and to me, what more evidence do you need that people are trying to kill you than looking at health outcomes and statistics? This is a doctor's office in Marigold, Mississippi in 1939. You see black people standing outside because black people could not go into waiting rooms. When I was in North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in 1971, I got strep throat. I needed to go to the doctor, and I created a cause célèbre because of the fact that I went into and sat in the white waiting room. It was 1971. These are, let's see, this is from a newspaper article, Why African Americans Were More Likely to Die During the 1918 Flu Pandemic. And the next one is a picture of nurses doing something but not treating, definitely not treating the men who participated in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And the headline for this one is a cost of the Tuskegee experiment on vaccine engagement around COVID. The infamous Tuskegee experiment, which started in 1932 and ended in 1972. Is this past? I Googled rural poverty. When do you think this photo was taken? It was taken in the 1980s. I Googled urban poverty. This article was published last week and was written by the National Urban League. So that's it for me for now, and thank you.
Good afternoon, beautiful audience. This is not the first time that I've had the honor of speaking following Barbara Smith, but it's always a challenge to follow Barbara. But I am always inspired, and thank you, Khury and Alan. That was just so beautiful, so moving. So drawing from threads of my family's traditions, I start by saying, we who believe in freedom and liberation, we who believe in the power of collective action by working people throughout the world, we who have been the wretched of the earth, we who have been naught, we shall bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. We will make the earth rise on new foundations. We shall be all. I start with expressions of hope, but really, and I believe all of us, are in despair. We have watched for 4 long months as Israel, with U.S. support, has imposed brutal collective punishment on the 2.1 or so million people Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, with almost 30,000 people known to have been killed, probably many more, many children, virtually the entire housing, cultural, transportation, food, infrastructure destroyed, with now 1 million people or more crowded into the southern city of Rafah, a safe place, supposedly, who are now under attack and who face an imminent and genocidal ground invasion announced by Israel. The international movement of solidarity with the Palestinian people has never been larger, more visible, more vocal, more diverse, more focused, more united, or more active. Yet the slaughter continues. One goal of today's event is to offer hope. Honestly, it's difficult to do so. One path to hope is to remember that the Palestinian people themselves continue to express hope in their dreams of freedom and peace. Another path is to recognize the historic, and for those of us who are involved in the anti-apartheid movement, miraculous effort of the government of post-apartheid South Africa to hold Israel legally accountable for its genocidal actions in Gaza, and to create sufficient international consensus and fortitude to prevent the continuation of the slaughter. Another path is to recall other difficult times and to remember that struggles of people to be free, for liberation, and for peace provide guidance, tools, and inspiration for the work we face today. To convince myself, and maybe all of you, to have hope, I'm going to do a lightning fast look at 80 years of history. Not all struggles are the same. Things don't always turn out okay. The moral arc of the universe Dr. King spoke of as always bending towards justice actually bends in unpredictable and uncertain ways. But there are lessons to learn and hope that can be gleaned. So, in 1944, the world was in the midst of the deadliest war in history, a war started by monopoly capital gone berserk, fueled by anti-Semitism, racism, and white supremacy taken to unimaginable and deadly extremes, with the death toll estimated to have been more than 70 million people, including the estimated 6 million Jews methodically exterminated. I didn't expect that. By the Nazis in their death camps. The US developed and used atomic weapons on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing over 200,000 deaths. How does the world recover from this? One way was to design a new international infrastructure, the United Nations, with the express purpose of saving, quote, succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in international fundamental human rights, as stated in the UN Charter. This is not to ignore that the UN has, by any objective measurement, clearly failed in its mission, largely due to the obstructionist role of the US, but to acknowledge that the mission and principles exist and offer a framework for working towards peace. After the founding of the UN in 1945, work soon started on the development of the International Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was established in 1948. This builds on the work of a Polish-Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin. This is just like an oddity I found. It's his ID badge for the first meetings of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Thought it was like an interesting artifact. He developed the concept of genocide and first attempted to create a working definition. Of course, the experience of genocide was not new to the world, but what was new was specifically defining it under international law. The creation of the UN, and a few years later, the promulgation of the Convention Against Genocide, offered struggling and oppressed people throughout the world a sense of hope and provided a framework within which to place their hopes and dreams of liberation. Now, when we say never again means never again for anyone, when we make a connection between the Nazi genocide of European Jews and the actions of Israel against the Palestinian people, we are breathing life into the dream that inspired the creation of the United Nations. And we are paying tribute to the millions, including the 6 million Jews killed by fascists in World War II. In 1947, as part of a recognition by the Black community at large of the value of these new tools, the NAACP, under the direction of W.E.B. Du Bois, published an appeal to the world, boldly presenting the conditions under which Black people in this country are forced to live and calling on the world community of nations to take action. Soon after, we have the development of the Convention Against Genocide. These are some of the key provisions which are up on the screen. My time is running out, which is a problem, but I'm going to keep going a little bit. Among other things, the convention not only prohibits the actual engagement of acts of genocide, but is quite relevant to today's world: incitement to commit genocide, the attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. In 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, a radical, communist-led, black-led group, has submitted the historic We Charge Genocide petition to the United Nations. This detailed expose of the violence and genocidal actions directed towards the black community was a call to action. One of the people that we honor today, as was mentioned earlier, is Ralph Poe, who lived in Albany for close to 50 years, but prior to that, worked as counsel to the Civil Rights Congress and was involved in working on the genocide petition. There is a direct line from the 1951 We Charge Genocide petition to the 2024 South African petition to the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of engaging in genocidal actions in Gaza. The radicals of 1951, in the midst of the McCarthy period and Jim Crow, created a paradigm of organizing, action, and legal advocacy utilizing the tools of international human rights law, which remains a model to this day and in part inspired South Africa's actions. Now, this is going to be really quick. I'm going to quickly go through just examples of how this concept of genocide has resonated within the black community in this country. We see repeated references to it over the years. So Malcolm X, in the final year of his life, talked about going to the United Nations, using the United Nations, using international human rights law as the tool by which to bring the cause of Black America to the world. This is a New York Times article about that. This is, for historians in the crowd, an excerpt from Malcolm X's FBI records, in which somebody was listening in on Ossie Davis and Clarence Jones, who was the leading civil rights lawyer at the time, and heard Clarence Jones and Ossie Davis speaking glowingly about what Malcolm X was planning, what he was doing. Smith, in 1964, put out this pamphlet, Genocide in Mississippi, again, using this concept. This is, jumping a little bit later, in 1967. This is a flyer for one of the largest marches against the war in Vietnam during that period in April 1967 in New York City, which featured as speakers, among others, Stokely Carmichael, now later known as Kwame Ture, and Martin Luther King. I was 10 and a half years old, and I was there. I don't remember any speeches, but I remember being there. And one of the things that Kwame Ture said at the time, which I just want to quote, when we look at the America which brought slaves here, this is from his speech at that Peace March, once in ships named Jesus, we charge genocide. When we look at the America which seized land from Mexico and practically destroyed the American Indians, we charge genocide. When we look at all of the acts of racist exploitation which this nation has committed, whether in the name of manifest destiny or anti-communism, we charge genocide. Dr. King, in one of the last speeches of his life, March 1968, in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, it's an amazing speech called The Other America, spoke about, among other things, said, we must say tonight that riot is the language of the unheard. Really powerful. And he also described, went through a whole lot, but he says the ultimate logic of racism is genocide. And if we think about what that means, we can't have a system based on white supremacy, we can't have a system based on racism that doesn't lead towards and result in genocidal actions. Black Panther Party, 1970, had a petition to the UN declaring the US to be engaging in genocide. In 2014, a group of youth activists in Chicago created a new movement called the We Charge Genocide movement, focused on police misconduct and police killings of Black people. This is my quick reference to the anti-apartheid movement in this country, which is part of what leads to how South Africa, a free South Africa, is in the position that it's in to do what it's doing and to challenge Israel in the World Court. These are buttons which both come from my own personal collection and also from the button collection of Vera Mike Michelson. And I was very privileged to get some of her buttons after she passed. And now we get to South Africa and its petition to the World Court. Now, I'm about to end, but I have one final thing I need to say, which is to recall that very recently, in an interview about her long history of solidarity with the Palestinian people, Angela Davis noted that Palestine is allowing us to be free, allowing us to imagine a very, very different world. I seem to have lost one of my pages here. That's okay. And that we struggle for Palestine not only because it is the right thing to do, Angela says, but because, quote, it represents a capacity to build new lives and new dreams for people everywhere. She goes on to say that one thing she has found so inspiring is that young Jewish people have taken the lead in this struggle. And I know that she didn't mean to privilege Jews or young Jews, but to note the significance of what it means to have young Jews in the lead here. And she said, it does make us dream of a world in which we will have eradicated racism and anti-Semitism and economic exploitation and gender violence. She ends the interview by saying, we deposit our dreams in Palestine. And so we have. Our commitment to Palestine solidarity is for the Palestinian people, but also for us and for all around the world struggling for freedom. The Palestinian people must win in order for us all to win. The Palestinian people must be free for all of us to be free. Ceasefire now, free Palestine.
Hello.
Hello.
First, I want to thank everybody here, and also JVP and my co-panel. It's an honor to be up here with these people, I'm new to the area, and this is sort of an introduction to the area in many ways, and so it's truly an honor to meet you all and to see everybody here today. And we're together in the struggle. So it's an honor. I'm going to open with a quote from Audre Lorde in 1985. As I write these words, I am listening to the United Nations special session concerning the state of emergency in South Africa. Their euphemism for the suspension of human rights for Blacks, which is the response of the Pretoria regime to the increasingly spontaneous eruptions in Black townships across that country. These outbursts against apartheid have greatly increased in the last 11 months since a new South African constitution further solidified the exclusion of the 22 million Black majority from the South African political process. These outbreaks, however severely curtailed by the South African police and military, are beginning to accomplish what Oliver Tambo, head of the African National Congress, hoped for in his call to make South Africa under apartheid ungovernable. So much Black blood has been shed upon that land. I thought, and so much more will fall. But blood will tell, and now the blood is speaking. Has it finally started? What some of us have prayed and worked and believed would and must happen, wondering when, because so few of us here in the United States even seemed to know what was going on in South Africa, nor cared to hear. I wanted to share that quote in part because it's relevant to what I was asked to discuss, but also because it's few things that I've heard or read since October have more aptly discussed the current moment than this. And specifically when she says, we've waited for them to rise up, and now the blood is telling the story. That's what we're seeing now. So, as the esteemed panelists already said, there's a long, long tradition of African and Black and Palestinian and Jewish solidarity that is organic and materially grounded. And it dates back to the 1950s, if not before. In the 1980s, Palestinians in the US, Palestinian students in particular, worked very, very closely with anti-apartheid activists. They organized demonstrations, engaged in civil disobedience struggles. They built shanty towns on college campuses so that people could understand what was happening in apartheid South Africa. In the late 80s, Palestinian students in this part of the US and the leadership of the Palestinian movement went to the ANC, the African National Congress office in New York City, and they said that they too want to launch a boycott campaign in the tradition of the anti-apartheid boycott. The South Africans and the leadership of the ANC were all in. Their support and commitment was uncompromising, as it is today. Shortly before the fall of the apartheid regime, Chris Hani, do you all know who Chris Hani is? Yeah. So Chris Hani is remembered, so you should Google him if you don't know who, a lot has been written about him, though not enough. He's remembered as, if not, like the second most popular figure of the Black liberation movement in South Africa, only after Nelson Mandela. He was murdered, he was assassinated, and that's why you don't know him, in part. But he was also sort of viewed as a number two in terms of leadership, and even Mandela, after his assassination, called him irreplaceable. So Hani visited the US shortly before the fall of apartheid, and he did a speaking tour. And during that tour, it was the Palestinians that were entrusted to serve as his security forces, because they were the most knowledgeable about how to engage in protest and political resistance, and then to organize events like this one that could potentially become violent. So this relationship was very, very deep. The anti-apartheid movement in many ways was a container for a host of solidarities among the communities that we're talking about here, but also other communities that we're not talking about today across Asia and Latin America. And what we're witnessing today are the descendants of these solidarities and these joint struggles. After the Reagan administration, so the term terrorist, which we're all very familiar with now, unfortunately, it's not a very old term. It became a legal term of art in the 80s, and it was Vice President Bush under Reagan, so President Bush, that led a task force, excuse me, that led a task force to deal with global terrorism. And then that slowly when it became a term of art. When the term was established, there were several groups that were like sort of primary targets. The Palestinians, the Iranians, the Libyans, and the South Africans, specifically the African National Congress. The African National Congress is remembered as being one of the first and most significant terrorist organizations from the eyes of the United States. It was during the Clinton administration that it really took a hold of the national imagination. And the Clinton administration, when it engaged in neutralizing the resistance movements in South Africa and in Ireland, and also the Palestinians through the Oslo Accords, it was at that point that we like when I was growing up, there wasn't a lot of political activity, not as much political activity as we saw like in the 60s and 70s, and then as we're seeing now. In part, it's because the Clinton administration neutralized a lot of the resistance efforts that were going on in the world prior to that era. But that moment was actually a short-lived moment, right? Not a long moment. And it was really an aberration from the norm, which is this long history of struggle and joint struggle among what I call in my research, but also like colloquially, as the global majority, the people of the world who are committed to the end of imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. So, sorry, I only have a minute left. So these movements of the global south and the third world, and this is how the Palestinians and the South Africans view them, they also include us. They also include those of us that are in the US and are the oppressed peoples of the US. They view us as the oppressed peoples of the US. And they say, how lucky are you? Che said this. How lucky are you to be able to fight from within the belly of the beast? So I thank you all today, not just for attending, but also for engaging in this long history of struggle. Because despite everything, despite the blood, and there's so much blood, this is the first time in my life where a new world is birthing itself. And it will be at great cost. We know that. We know that from our histories. It will be at great cost. But what's on the other side stands to be more beautiful and more just and more free than any of us have ever experienced. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I have to start with gratitude for the people who made this happen. And I have to say what an honor it is to share this space with living legends who have contributed so much, speaking personally, who have inspired me and who continue to inspire. And I want to just call one more legend who's no longer with us into the space, a guy named Frank Sullivan. The last time I was in this building was for his funeral, before this gorgeous addition was added. And Frank was the dad of my friend, Molly, who I took to the prom at Albany High. Go Falcons. You know, when I would come home, when I was in college, and I would come home on break and visit with my friend Molly and talk to Frank and tell him about my activism, like so many of the adults who I grew up with, as I became a young adult, he shared with me his own history and how he was, among other things, the editor of a socialist newspaper called the Albany Spirit. some people know, if you know, you know, that existed in the 70s. And he was also part of the Albany Greens. So I want to call him into the space and honor him, and along with all the people who we honored at the beginning and who we've honored throughout this conversation, among other things, as a reminder that those of us who today are grappling with this catastrophe in Palestine, who are heartbroken, who are thinking, what can we possibly do? How do we navigate this moment? What is our contribution? To know that we are not the first people to ever ask questions like this, and we won't be the last. And so here we are to make our contribution in this moment. And as we do so, we honor all those who came before us. I want to talk about, we heard this incredible kind of history of solidarities prior to this moment that inform this moment and inform our work in this time, because this is, of course, a moment of incredible violence, but it is also one of an outpouring of solidarity with the people of Palestine. And as Mark said, perhaps it's never been like this. I want to say particularly in the United States, because when you leave this country, as with so many things, solidarity with Palestine is a given in many places in the world. But what we are in the midst of right now is a breakthrough here. Never in the history of this country has there been this number of people activated for Palestine. People in my life, I'm sure in yours, who hadn't thought too much about Palestine 5 months ago, have gotten arrested for Palestine in the past few months. So I want to say a word about what brought us to this point, and in particular talk about the question of Black Palestine solidarity, which I would argue we are in the second great wave of in this moment in this country. So I have to start, however, with the decades of organizing, particularly led by Palestinian folks, that came up prior to this moment, and it has taken so many forms. So think about an organization like Students for Justice in Palestine, which is 30 years old, I believe, as of last year. Any current or former members of SJP in the audience tonight? Yes, okay. It is incredibly significant that at this point, after 3 decades of organizing, of SJP organizing, it is the case that in more or less any city in this country, there are students who are advocating for Palestine. That simply was not true not too long ago. And so there's been a kind of coming of age of that. At this point, generations of people who have gone to college have encountered a pro-Palestine argument. I think about organizations like the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which was started over 20 years ago, actually then called the US Campaign Against the Israeli Occupation. This was an organization that, among other things, organized churches and other civil society organizations to think about Palestine and do some basic education around Palestine, which is so difficult in this country, as we know, because of all of the pressures to dissuade us from identifying with Palestinians, from sympathizing with them, etc. We think about the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, a campaign that was crafted by Palestinians in Palestine, that was endorsed by all of the key organizations of Palestinian civil society, and then offered to the world as a way that anybody in the world, wherever you are, can in a nonviolent way make your contribution, boycotting the Israeli economy, divesting from the Israeli economy, and boycotting institutions that buttress Israeli apartheid. And lastly, I want to say that there's a certain coming of age of Palestinian America as well, which is very significant. The fact that, certainly the conversation about Palestinians it leaves much to be desired, let's say that, in the US mainstream media. But it is the case now that alongside the racist and Islamophobic vitriol that we hear on the news about Palestinian people. We also have Noura Erakat, the Palestinian legal scholar, on CNN to contest that. We have Ayman Mohyeddin, the Palestinian-American journalist on MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. And so that has all led to something very different. And when I learned about Palestine as a high school student, I learned very quickly that it was not popular to be in solidarity with Palestinians. And even something like this, a room of this size filled with people, to talk about Palestine was unimaginable. What I want to conclude on, though, is the question of Black Palestine solidarity in particular. And I would argue the last great wave was in the 1960s, not surprisingly coinciding with the last great wave of the Black freedom struggle, right? And this moment, I would argue, began in 2014, the one that we are in right now, which was a fateful year. Early in that year, Eric Garner was murdered by police, by NYPD on the streets of Staten Island. And in the summer, Mike Brown was murdered by Ferguson, Missouri police as well. And that sparked the Ferguson uprising that summer, which coincided with the 2014 Israeli bombardment of Gaza. And so folks may remember at that time, you would watch the news and see what happened that day in Ferguson and then see what happened in Gaza. And the connections were being made for us. I mean, Barbara was talking about the history of lynching and the kind of spectacle of violence that history carries in this country. And I remember in 2014, during that bombing of Gaza, Israelis in southern Israel took lawn chairs and they watched as Israeli planes bombed the people of Gaza. Spectacular violence, right? The connections were straightforward, so straightforward that there were Palestinians and Black folks who made the connections. Palestinians in Palestine who went on Twitter and other social media and said, here's how you deal with tear gas. We know. Here's how you deal with it, rebels of Ferguson. There were not one but two statements of solidarity from Palestine to the Black struggle here in Missouri. And so in that context, me and a friend named Christian Davis Bailey, a dear comrade, said, we want to return the favor. Let's write a statement in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And we started working on it that summer, 2014, and then we stopped because we got really busy because you may remember that fall was wild. It was an outpouring of Black Lives Matter protests. And so it took us a year, and we said, all right, we're going to put out this statement a year, on the year anniversary of the Ferguson Uprising. And it was such a good thing that we waited a year, because in that time in between, there were delegations of Black folks to Palestine. There was so much building that happened, such that when we issued the statement, it was received in a way that it wouldn't have been if we had just done it in 2014. And the last thing I want to note is the next wave within a wave of Black Lives Matter struggle, which was the 2020 uprisings. Because that was so significant in terms of shaking this country and shaking people's understanding of this country, not in a superficial way, but in a deep way, where we finally started to have serious conversations about slavery, not as this thing that's ancient history, but that shaped every single aspect of American society. The legal reality, the education system, the health system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was not only something that advanced that deep Black critique of history in this country, but it combined it. It was a moment of Black and Indigenous critique, actually, right? I think about long-standing Indigenous struggles, like, for example, you may remember that the Washington football team used to have another name, a horrendous name, as did the Cleveland baseball team. Those changed in 2020, right? There were years of people, Indigenous folks, campaigning to change those names. 2020 was the year that we crossed the finish line, right, on those things, right? And it is why all across this country now we acknowledge the lands and the people who have stewarded these lands for centuries. And so people who experienced that, who went through that here and looked at this country with different eyes, now are looking at Israel with different eyes, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. This isn't too complicated. This is familiar, actually. So, again, I know that we confront absolute horror in this moment, but we have more power than we ever have. when it comes to advocating for Palestine. And it's incumbent on us to learn what to do with it. And in doing so, we honor the ancestors who we've called in tonight, and we fulfill our great responsibility as people located in this country, which enables that violence. Thank you.
So I'm going to open the question and answer period with a question for each of you. Friends, if you have questions, write them on your note cards. You have about 5 minutes to get those written down and pass them to the middle. Someone will come and collect them. We're going to start in the present and move our way back. So I'm going to ask you a question first, Khury. Because you have this really, I won't say unique, but you have a special position in that you see the wide view of organizing from the grassroots to the halls of Congress. And a lot of us are wondering, how do we use our power? And is it making a difference? So I'm curious if you can shed some light on the impacts that you're seeing of the various strategies that we engage with at these different levels.
Yeah. Is this on? How about now? All right, cool. Yeah, I have kind of a weird job where I am on one hand in touch with people who are working with members of Congress, bless the, not the people in Congress, but bless the people working to push those people, and bless the other ones too, but it's a different kind of blessing they need. And I work with the people who are locking down at these weapons factories, you know what I mean? And who are in these streets. And I think for those who are not plugged into the bizarre world of Washington, it can be very difficult to see the impact. But I promise you, Washington is being shaken right now in a massive way. And they frankly don't know what to do because this is actually, I would argue this has actually never happened before, that a question of US foreign policy that does not involve, this isn't like a US invasion with US troops, right? This is a different question of US foreign policy that may cost this president the election. That has never happened before. And so they don't know what to do, and that is power in our hands. And I'll say, you know, I work with a colleague named Phyllis Bennis. She was, yeah, shout out to Phyllis. It's my boss. She was shaped by the era of the U.S. war in Vietnam. And so we talk a lot. We have a lot of intergenerational conversation. And looking at the staffers in the US Congress who have walked out in protest of their bosses, members of Congress, looking at the people who work for the State Department, some of whom are resigning and many more are signing letters, open letters, against US policy. The people who work at USAID who are confronting their boss, Samantha Power, who wrote the book on genocide called A Problem from Hell, and she is now enabling genocide. I said, this kind of protest within the halls of power is the greatest I've seen in my lifetime. And she said, the greatest in mine too. And I was like, what? Didn't this happen during the war in Vietnam? And she said, we never, during that war, saw current employees at the State Department dissenting from US foreign policy. So the tragedy is that the US commitment to Israel is not a superficial one. It is a deep commitment. And that means that as much as we are shaking, we have not yet won, but we are shaking and we are moving this, absolutely. We are seeing the cracks form, and now is not the time to give up, but to keep on pushing.
I am stirred and moved to know that there are cracks forming in the halls of power. So thank you for giving us that insight. A question for you. I'm very curious your insights on this current uprising and what implications you see for the United States as a global imperial power.
So I think it's worth noting that in the last several hours, Israel has just started bombing the interior of Lebanon. And, there's been talk of whether or not this is going to turn into a regional war for months now. And it looks like it's heading in that direction. Prior to the last couple of weeks, it's been a lot of tit for tat, right? The regional struggles. But now, if you should watch the images of Israel's bombings of Lebanon. They're quite serious, and they're not bombing. They're bombing civilians in Lebanon, civilian neighborhoods and civilians in Lebanon. So, it's important to know that even though the actions of Israel are horrible and have been horrible for decades, Israel is not an independent actor. It does what the U.S. tells it to do. The U.S. historically has sometimes had disagreements with Israel. This is evident in the archives. But by and large, Israel does not take any major or serious actions like the bombing of Lebanon without the approval of the U.S. And so the question really is, and I mean, everybody in the room who's old enough to know, life in the U.S. has gotten much harder than it used to be, right? The infrastructure is bad. We're not keeping up with climate change. Our schools are bad. Our water is undrinkable. There's sewage, and this is like, for me, coming from new to the area, we get these updates from about what's going on in the area from the county. And we're constantly getting sewage updates about sewage being spilled into the Hudson River. So that's the state of affairs here. Not to mention public health and the COVID crisis. And so the question is, how much longer is the U.S. going to go on like this? And the cracks that Khury talked about are also evident in the election, right? There's a former president tried to stage a coup, now running for office again. If we were talking about South Africa or Chile or any other country in the world like this, people would call it a failed state or on the way to a failed state. So, at some point, the U.S. needs to decide, are we going to continue to bomb everybody that disagrees with us, or just the brown and black peoples of the world, and Asian? Or are we going to start to sit with our neighbors at the table and solve the world's crises together? That's what the world is asking for. That's all the world is asking for. We may have disagreements. We may completely disagree with governments all around the world about the way they run things. But there is no government that is saying they seek world domination with the most powerful, most heinous military in world history. Nobody has said that other than the United States. So the question, because of all these crises that I just mentioned, for us and everybody else throughout the world, is all the more significant now. What kind of world do we imagine as the US empire falls? An empire that dies from within, and its people die too, because they can't access clean water or health care? Or a nation state sitting next to other nation states as equals, trying to make sure that the earth is livable for our children and grandchildren. This is not radical talk. This is just not. This is purely pragmatic talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Mark, I'm really moved by the long march of intergroup solidarity that you talked about, and that history is truly fortifying. Something that I know less about is beyond sort of the surface headlines of the civil rights movement is the history of Jewish and Black radical solidarity. And I'm wondering if you can shed some light on that for us.
Is this on? Okay, great. Thank you, Leah. I want to, in some of our planning meetings, I spoke in a denigrating way about the image that we always see as supposed proof from the mainstream Jewish community of the history of Jewish solidarity and support for Black civil rights and Black human rights. And, there's a famous image of, in fact, a wonderful rabbi marching with Dr. King. And that image is presented to us as, see, Jews have always stood with Blacks, when we know that there's a surface aspect to what's being presented to us, and that was the liberal Jewish support for the Black civil rights movement, in fact, vanished quite quickly, and it vanished as soon as the Black liberation movement in this country became more militant and spoke out in a more powerful way. And it vanished as soon as the issue of affirmative action as a necessary step in order to remedy decades and decades of exclusion from higher education and from employment was voiced as a key demand of the Black community. And it vanished as the Black community, as has been presented here, began to express solidarity with Palestinians. So that's one portion of the Jewish community, the mainstream Jewish community, which really now has absolutely no claim, period, of standing in support of Black liberation, of Black freedom, and Black human rights. But there are other traditions in the Jewish community, and which I think are very important for us to know about. Obviously, we're not the mainstream, so obviously we have fewer numbers. But there is a history, which my family was part of, and many other families, that in some ways goes back to people who left Eastern Europe, not because they wanted to leave their homes, but because they had no choice due to pogroms, due to violence, due to anti-Semitism, due to poverty. These were migrations of no choice but of necessity. And people ended up in New York City and throughout the United States. And there were communities of Jews throughout the United States, starting in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and so on, that were deeply radical. These are people who organized, for example, the garment workers in New York City. These are people who fought against the tenements on the Lower East Side. These are people who organized and worked with early socialist movement, the communist movement, and so forth. And these are people who began to understand imperfectly, as we look back, certainly very imperfectly, but began to think about and understand that there was a key fundamental issue in this country, which was racism against the Black people in this country. And there are people who began to understand that until we address this issue, this central issue in the United States history and in American society, that no one would ever be able, in fact, to be free in this country. And so that's a tradition, and I've mentioned this also in our planning discussions. I'll mention it here. So my mother grew up in a community of such people. There was like a red belt in the Bronx, okay? And the divisions were not between, conservatives and radicals. The divisions were between communists and socialists and Trotskyites and so forth. Those were the divisions in the neighborhood. And my father also grew up in a family similar to that. I've never seen the movie Gone with the Wind. Is there anybody here who has not seen, raise your hand if you have not seen Gone with the Wind.
Lucky you.
Fantastic, I'm so impressed. So I've never seen it because my mother made clear, you can't see that movie. And she made clear because she remembered as a young teenager in the late 1930s that her community was part of these boycotts when Gone with the Wind first came out. People picketed the movie theaters. Jews in New York City were picketing the movie theaters because of this racist movie. So it's a tradition there. And then if we look at the world that the We Charge Genocide petition came out of was a world that was filled with Black Jewish radical solidarity. Some of the people who helped write the We Charge Genocide petition were Jewish. A number of the signers of the petition were Jewish. And a number of the people who worked in the Civil Rights Congress to promote the work of the Civil Rights Congress and the work of the We Charge Genocide movement were Jewish. And there was just intense solidarity that existed. Again, it's imperfect. I'm not saying there's some glowing perfect history here. What I'm saying is that there are traditions that it allowed me to grow up in a home where not that I didn't have to learn better how to be anti-racist, but I was inoculated against white supremacy by the home and the household I grew up in. And so that's just, I think it's important. And these traditions are also one of the roots of Jewish Voice for Peace. So many people who helped to start JVP, many people who have become active in JVP also have these roots. There are many threads that go into JVP, but that's one of the roots that leads to JVP. And one of the reasons why JVP is now in a position to help to take the lead in this movement, because there are people, that are multi-generational, so there's people who went through the Vietnam War period and so forth. There are people who have these histories and are bringing them to this current movement, as well as, of course, the extraordinary, beautiful young people who are really leading the movement. I say one more quick thing. It's not an answer to your question. Because people talked about Oliver Tambo and the South Africans and the Global South, I just want to say this keffiyeh that I'm wearing today was given to me by a Palestinian Liberation Organization member in Havana, Cuba, in 1978, when I attended the World Festival of Youth and Students. I was young once, and the closing ceremony of that was like a 10-day sort of event. Closing ceremony in I guess it's called Revolution Square, featured Fidel Castro, of course, who spoke for a while. But it also featured Oliver Tambo and Yasser Arafat. So these were the three speakers. This is 1978, and the solidarity that was clear. You have South Africa, the leader outside of South Africa of the African National Congress, Oliver Tambo, Yasser Arafat, and Fidel Castro at the same podium, speaking to thousands and thousands and thousands of young people from around the world. So there is a history there as well.
Thank you so much, Mark. So the question I have for you, Barbara, you've already been so generous in sharing some of your personal experience living through Jim Crow, and I was moved by the doctor's office example, and wondering for those of us who were born after that time period, if you could shed more light on your individual experience living through this time period.
Hello? Oh, great. Okay. Oh, and yes, thank you so much for that, Leah. I lived through Jim Crow. My grandmother, who was the primary caretaker for my twin sister and I, we were the only children in the family. She was born in about 1886 in rural Georgia. Everyone in my family, in my household in Cleveland, Ohio, was from the rural South, from Dublin, Georgia. So my sister and I had the great advantage of growing up in a household of Southern, primarily Black women. And as anybody who knows me and who's heard me talk about my family, they did not play. They did not play. So, and whatever, anything I've ever accomplished in life is because of them. I want to say something first, though, about Black and Jewish solidarity. I'm a member of JVP. I've been a member of Jewish Voice for Peace since 2019, so I didn't join because of the most recent horrors that are transpiring that are also, I like the imagery that more than one of you have used about how bloody this period is, because if anyone has ever been present at a birth or given birth, there is blood. And the fact that we don't want the misery, we want to stop the incredible crimes, the incredible nightmare of what is being perpetrated, but there is something poetically metaphorical about how we are birthing into a new period in human history. And as often is the case in human experience, it comes bathed in blood. But anyway, around Black and Jewish solidarity, Mark mentioned that he was about 10 years old, 10 and a half perhaps, when he went with his family to the mobilization, spring mobilization to end the war in Vietnam on April 15th of 1967. It started in Central Park and marched to the United Nations. Guess who else was there? I was there, and he just said he didn't see me, surprisingly. And unlike Mark, I was a sophomore in college. And we came down. I went to college in Massachusetts, Mount Holyoke. I went to Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts, and we came down from what was then the Ford College area. And that was an incredible, memorable experience for me. It's the second time in my life that I saw Martin Luther King in person. So, how did growing up in the last years, the last decades of Jim Crow affect me? It's really hard to grow up knowing that the world sees you as nothing and sees you as inferior. I always say that Black families are the bulwark against white supremacy and against a society that is absolutely focused upon the destruction, not just of the Black body, but also of the Black human spirit. So our family was a bulwark against that. And between the family and our church and also our neighborhood, it was a really functioning Black community, and it was a really functioning family. I came from a functional family, and that's despite the fact that we didn't have a lot of men's. And I just say men's because that's what they would have been, men's. We didn't have a lot of men's, but we had a couple of them. And when the Moynihan report came out, I think in '67, the report on the Negro family, and my dear aunt, my mother's sister, I only know the maternal side of my family, she used to order publications from the U.S. government printing office, because there was no internet, so the only way you could find something was to read it on paper. And so she had the mailing list, or the catalog, and she would order things. So she actually ordered a copy of the report. And so we had a copy of the report at home. I was in college at the time, as I said, and I'm looking at this thing, and it's basically saying that I'm supposed to be like some kind of pathological maniac because of the fact that I grew up in this home that didn't have enough men's in it. Be that as it may. Well, I did come out as a lesbian, there's that. But the thing is that, whatever, but be that as it may, it was tough. It was really tough. We went to integrated schools. Virtually nobody in my age group who's Black can say that they did that. But because of residential segregation, our family had been able to buy a house in a neighborhood that was changing from white to Black. If you want to know that history, just see the play or the movie made from the play of Raisin in the Sun. It's very much a story in some ways of my family, although I don't know the struggle per se that they faced. There were very few neighborhoods in Cleveland, one of the 10 largest cities in the United States at the time. Cleveland was humongous, and had all the cultural institutions that you would expect of a city of that size. But I had heard about a place called New York, and I knew I had to be here. Be that as it may, there were very few neighborhoods where black people could buy homes. Every black person in Cleveland during my growing up years lived on one side of town. It was the east side. We could not live on the west side. We did not dare venture onto the west side. When people asked me about something on the west side, a landmark, a building, something or other, I said, I don't know anything about it because we couldn't go there for fear of being hurt. And as I said, we could live on the east side, but there were many segregated, all-white neighborhoods on the east side, too. All of the suburbs were segregated. So black people could not live in suburbs even if they had the money, and of course most black families did not. Some black doctors and people who were professionals attempted, as they did in many other cities, to move to those kinds of enclaves. And what generally happened, and I've read about Detroit, I know about other incidents, what often happened is the home was vandalized, burned, and they were run out. So it was a constant experience of violence, constant. Violence was a reality that I grew up with on a daily basis, not because it was happening in my home, not because it was happening in my neighborhood, not even because it was happening in my city, but because of the fact that my family was so racially conscious and read so much, including a couple of black newspapers that were weeklies, the Pittsburgh Courier and our local newspaper, the Cleveland Call-and-Post, and Jet. Of course, we got Jet magazine, we got Albany. So the thing is, like, this information was funneled to us. I remember when Emmett Till was killed. Why? Not because I was reading any newspapers. I was only 8 at the time. But his name was mentioned at the dinner table. And I'm sure that my sister and I asked, who's Emmett Till? What happened to Emmett Till? We could tell by the level of sadness and distress in our family members' faces that something bad had happened. And because they tried to shelter us, I'm sure they said something like, well, he was a little boy and something really bad happened to him. They would never tell us the full story. I remember when the Rosenbergs were executed. Yes, I do. I'm the same age as one of the Rosenberg children. Robert Meerpool, I think he and I are the same age. The reason I remember it is because, of course, I remember everything, but because of the fact also it was something that was being talked about, and my sister and my response to it was, how could they kill somebody's parents like that? How could they do that? I mean, we were little babies ourselves, and we were so upset about it. So now Leah is going to show, did you show my picture? Okay, bring it back. Bring it back. This person is my mother, Hilda Beale Smith. Her dates are 1922, that's when she was born, in the South. And she died in 1956 when I was 9 years old, and when my sister and I were 9 years old. Now I want you to show the next slide. This is a slide that shows the people who were murdered in the Moores Ford Massacre. And the Moores Ford Massacre happened in Georgia, and it happened in July of 1946. I was born in November of 1946. I only found out about the Moores Ford Massacre, in which 2 black couples, one of the men being a veteran of World War II, and one of the women being 7 months pregnant, were killed by a mob on this bridge. It's a Moores Ford Bridge Massacre. I only found out about it a few years ago. But when I looked at the date, I said, oh my God. My mother was carrying my sister and me when the Moores Ford Massacre happened. Given the level of awareness and the fact that my family was from Georgia, they knew. Given that, I thought, what was it like for her to be a young woman pregnant with, she didn't know she was having twins, because most people didn't know that in those days. They didn't really have a way, unless you had a really good, midwife or obstetrician. It just happened. So the thing is, she's pregnant, and she's hearing about this murder of these two couples, a person just like her, and these beautiful people. George, they are from left to right, May and George Dorsey, Roger and Dorothy Malcolm. That's what I'm going to end with. That's what it was like to grow up during Jim Crow.
So we just have time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to simultaneously open it up to you all to ask questions of one another, to reflect on what you've heard, and also ask our moderator number 2 if you've selected some questions, you want to read them off. So maybe we'll do one audience question and then one panelist question and like that. Are you ready?
Great.
Okay.
So our first audience question is, at a time when international labor, the left in general, are historically weak, and when public opinion has no effective impact on public policy, for those of us here in the belly of the imperial beast, where do we go and what are our next steps?
We'll just have one person answer each question. Who wants to take that one? Yeah.
Been thinking about this a bunch, and I gotta bring it back to Albany, in the time when I was getting political, because that time in this place, there was a sense of power outside of the official channels of power, and in fact, for those of us getting political at the time, we came into a sensibility that powerful institutions are the problem. You know what I mean? Like, they're not, the point is not to, like, I don't know, invite a conversation with the people in power and hope that they do the right thing. It was like, resist them. See the problems created? That's their fault. You know what I mean? And I was just talking with my dear friend Laura, who's somewhere in the audience, who we radicalized together in high school. And the most, I think the most influential force, political force on the left in that time, around the world, and certainly here, was this movement called the Zapatistas. You may know it. This is a group of indigenous people in Chiapas, Mexico, who were resisting, all that's wrong, with the world, but were also cultivating their own spaces of power. And it was like, we don't know what y'all are doing out there. We're doing this here. We are building a feminist, anti-capitalist, alternative power center that honors nature. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't realize how exceptional that moment was, but we have to return to it. I think that at the moment, it is so difficult for people to imagine power or change outside of the confines of, like, governments and nation states. And the only change, in my opinion, that has ever been worth anything has come from outside. So we have to go back to cultivating that.
Ashe. We have a question or comment from one of the panelists. We're going to try to keep them to about 1 minute so we can get a few more.
About that?
No, not about that. Like your own question for each other, or a comment, a reaction that someone else has said. It's okay if you don't. We can go
Move on.
Thank you.
Could you take your hats down when you speak?
So the next audience question is about some of the international structures that we've seen referenced today in the 1951 petition. And it's really asking, what is the future for our movements of international structures like the International Criminal Court of Justice, the UN, in the context where there are both being avenues for these petitions and also the fear that the actual consequences on the ground are being ignored, or that potentially these structures lack the teeth to create the change that we so desperately need?
Sorry about all the coughing. I'm recovering, but I don't have COVID. Good news. Excuse me. So, the UN is a very imperfect institution. Notwithstanding, I agree with everything that Mark said, but it was not created to challenge systems of global domination. It was never meant to do that. And international law in general is also an imperfect institution. And again, it was never meant to challenge systems of global domination. It was never meant to challenge imperialism or global capitalism. So, in light of that, nations have come forward, like Nicaragua and Bolivia, quite recently actually, and have called for massive reform of the UN. And it's been written about, it's actually quite interesting. Nations have also called for the abolition of the Security Council. And I think an interesting question, and this goes back to what I was saying about living as neighbors in the world together, is what kind of institution facilitates that? Excuse me. What kind of international legal framework would facilitate that? Despite, like, I'm certainly very critical of the law, but I believe that we need it. And every system of government in the world has a legal framework. No matter what kind of system of governance it is, an Islamic system, a communist system, a socialist system, a capitalist system, liberal democratic, whatever, they all have legal frameworks. And so as this new world is being born, one of the questions that I think is really important to think about is what kind of law do we want to create that upholds humanity as opposed to capitalism?
So next audience question is, I'll first say thank you for connecting the lives here in America to the lives of those in Palestine and South Africa. Even here in the capital region during Freedom Summer, we saw army tanks got tear gassed and assaulted all at the hands of the police. So the question is, how can we as a community hold our own governor, New York State, and local structures accountable in our struggle for a ceasefire?
That's a really fantastic question, for which there is not a fantastic answer. Sometimes the best questions don't have good answers. I guess I think, and this relates also to the United Nations, it relates to the labor movement. All of these things are arenas of struggle, and we can choose as activists and as activist groups which arenas we wish to participate in or don't, and different people can make different choices and about which arenas you want to participate in. But my opinion is that all of these arenas are important. Doesn't mean that everybody has to be in all of these arenas. I think the political struggle, meaning electoral work, is important, clearly not the answer, right? I think the UN, as imperfect as it is a forum and arena of struggle, clearly not the answer. I think the labor movement, which in a little bit of maybe good news in the past 4 months, we have gone from one voice in the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO, the president of the American Postal Workers Union, speaking out for a ceasefire. We have our local Postal Workers Union president in the audience. One of the few Jewish members of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, spoke out for a ceasefire and was roundly criticized. He was disparaged. The only other, or one of the only other Jewish members of the Executive Council spoke out against it. That's Randy Weingarten. The person who spoke out for it is Mark, what's his last name? Okay, I'm forgetting his last name. Dimmenstein, Mark Dimmenstein. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the only, if not the only other Jewish member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, spoke out against it. This is, 3 months ago, right? And now, the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO in this country has come out for a ceasefire. Now, so what happened? Number one, there's a groundswell of labor activists around the country who are demanding that their movement, the labor movement, take a stand on this issue of key human rights and humanitarian safety and dignity. And there were all of the rest of us who were speaking out, creating this groundswell of voices. And the situation on the ground in Gaza has gotten worse and worse and worse, and became even harder to ignore. So I'm not presenting that as the AFL-CIO Executive Council is now this fantastic body. It's not. What I'm saying is these things can be moved. These are places of struggle for those who choose to be in those places of struggle. And I think that we should never not engage in struggle wherever we are. And that includes our workplaces, our neighborhoods, our schools, our PTAs, our churches and synagogues and other institutions of religious worship. Every place that we are, we should be engaged in a struggle for a better world. And at this moment, that means every place that we find ourselves, we need to speak out for Palestine.
If I could add just a word to that, I think that we as a movement have to become strategists, all of us. We have to think about strategy. And, the Palestine movement for so long has been so politically marginalized that the question of strategy has been, when nobody's listening to you, what you say and how you say it are less, it's a different kind of relevance, do you know what I mean? And so I think that thus far, and I think this is true not just on the question of Palestine, but in general in the US left, we tend to approach things in terms of principle. I believe in a free Palestine. Well, that's great. Well, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna do our part to contribute to a free Palestine? Now we have power for the first time ever, really. And we have to think as strategists. And so one thing, I mentioned earlier, that the movement has been so powerful, has been so impactful, that it has actually it's shaken the halls of power themselves, such that there are emerging divisions. Biden is not happy that the AFL-CIO is talking about ceasefire. The 60 plus members of Congress who have come out for ceasefire, it's not nearly enough. But that has never happened before in US history, that the majority of people in this country want a ceasefire. There are divisions among the elite, and our role as a movement is to exploit those divisions and force them open as much as possible. And we should use the tools at our disposal. I want to, I don't see her anymore, but I want to shout out Alice Green, who, legend, who, when I was a kid, at an MLK Day event in down at the Plaza, which my mom took me to. Shout out to my mom. My mom's also here. I saw Alice Green. I saw the governor speaking, and Alice Green stood up with a banner that said "No more prisons," and she got dragged out by the state police. And that was the first time I ever saw anybody get arrested. Okay, so we confront power, right? But But we also have to have a mode beyond just confrontation. Like, these are tactical questions. And I think that often we take the question of principle and elevate it to tactics. And actually, the context matters. And that's kind of unfortunate. I mean, it'd be way easier if we could do the same thing everywhere at every time. But we are in a new moment, a new time with new opportunities. What does it mean locally? What does it mean that the International Court of Justice has just said that Israel's plausibly committing a genocide? So, Albany City Council, do you have something to say about that? Are you going to be quiet on the question that the World Court has said there's plausibly a genocide taking place, and they should be forced to answer that question? I think that's how we approach it.
So we are going to let Barbara Smith have the last word because we're just about at time. But first, I want to give you all your homework. So after Barbara has spoken, you're welcome to continue to interact with each other. And we have some reflection questions. We would love you to find somebody you didn't come with, to walk over to the snack hall with, and to discuss these questions. What did you learn that feels important to you? What life experience or knowledge do you have to add to this topic? Who needs to hear the information shared today and why? And what do you plan to do next based on what you learned? So take a picture if you need to. That's your homework before you leave this building to start that conversation with someone, and that conversation continues. There are wonderful community organizations tabling in the back. There's also information at the front that you can use to learn more about how to get involved. Please do continue to wear your mask until you get to the separate snack room, and then that's a mask optional room. And I do want to, before I hand it back over to Barbara to give us our closing words, I want to thank you deeply, each and every one of you, for standing for peace, for justice, for freedom, for solidarity, and for understanding that our well-being is inexorably bound to one another as a human community. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being such a wonderful group of participants with us. We had big dreams for this event. I think our dreams have been fulfilled. Particularly the fact that there are just so many of you here. And I'm looking at Alan in the front row, Alan Thompson. I profusely thanked Khury, but Khury could not have done it without you. And Alan Thompson is a wonderful musical gift that we have here in our area, and he was kind enough to connect with Khury and to accompany her on that beautiful piano over there. As I said, we had big dreams for this. The struggle continues, and one of the dreams that we had is that we were going to have a book table, and there were going to be books for sale, but we didn't quite get that one together. But what we do have is a resource list that everybody who registered, and of course you had to register with your email address, each of you will receive the resource list that we compiled in a few days after we rest up. And we really encourage you to look at the list. It includes things to listen to watch, to look at, and to read. And we really hope that you will be inspired to find out more about this history. I have a book. This would have been one of the books that we had on our table. It's a book called By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. It's by Margaret Burnham. And Margaret Burnham is an extraordinary attorney and someone who I had the pleasure to meet when I lived in Boston in the 1970s. And Mark knows her as well. There's a website that we will include on your resource list. What she has been working on is civil rights cold cases and murders that happened, I think, from around 1920 to 1960s. These were not officially classified as lynchings. These were other murders of black people for whom no one paid any kind of criminal justice penalty. Because lynching has a particular definition. It usually involves several people hanging, torture, but this is another set of these extrajudicial killings. So I don't want to end on a sad note, but I just wanted to point out there are just a lot of resources for us. And thank you ever so much. Stay strong. And as all of our wonderful panelists, who I would like to thank, have said, we got to keep on with this struggle. We cannot stop now. We've gotten so much inspiration about where we are historically that I wasn't even thinking about. I was just working every day trying to get stuff done. But thank you so much, and enjoy yourself with some light refreshments.